The agricultural finance situation in South Carolina and across the American South in the late 1970s and early 1980s was a situation that had been shaped by the specific combination of the commodity price run-up of the mid-1970s and the interest rate environment that the Federal Reserve's inflation-fighting policy was producing in 1979 and 1980. The commodity prices had encouraged expansion. The interest rates were making the debt that funded the expansion increasingly expensive to service. The equipment manufacturers and their finance divisions had responded to the interest rate problem by structuring the zero-interest promotion programs that addressed the rate problem. In the short term, by absorbing the interest cost into the equipment price or into the financial instruments structure, rather than passing it directly to the buyer. These programs were financially complex in ways that the marketing materials did not describe, and that most of the farmers who were being offered the terms did not have the financial background to evaluate. They were also marketing materials that were working, because 0% for 5 years was an offer that was easy to understand and difficult to refuse when the prevailing rates on standard agricultural notes were in double digits and rising. Ray Norwood's dealership had been running the promotion because the promotion was producing results, and the results were equipment sales that the prevailing rate environment had been suppressing. From the dealer's perspective, the promotion was solving a real problem in the sales environment, and the problem it was solving was real. What neither the dealer nor most of the buyers could fully evaluate was the condition of the financial institution backing the promotional terms and the specific characteristics of the financial instruments that were supporting the zero-interest offers. The John Deere dealer in Orangeburg, South Carolina, was running the zero-interest financing promotion for the 4th consecutive season when Horace Ipton walked in on a Tuesday afternoon in March of 1980 and looked at the 4,240 diesel on the showroom floor. The promotion was a real promotion. John Deere Credit was offering 0% financing on new equipment purchases for qualified buyers for a term of 5 years. A promotion that the Agricultural Finance Division had developed in response to the interest rate environment of the late 1970s, which had been making the standard financing terms unattractive to the farmers who were looking at the prevailing rates on conventional agricultural notes. 0% for 5 years was not a small offer in 1980. The prevailing interest rates on agricultural equipment loans through the federal land banks and the production credit associations were in the range of 13 to 16%, and the rate was still rising as the Federal Reserve's fight against inflation was producing the rate increases that would take the federal funds rate to 20% by June of 1980, a 0% term for 5 years. Against those prevailing rates was a meaningful financial benefit. The dealer's name was Ray Norwood, and he had been selling John Deere equipment in Orangeburg County for 18 years, and he had been running the 0% promotion for 2 of those years, with the specific satisfaction of a man who has a marketing tool that works. Because the promotion was producing sales that the standard financing terms had not been producing. The 18 years from 1962 to 1980 had been the 18 years that had produced Horace's specific understanding of what the Orangeburg County row crop operation required and what it could sustain. The understanding that a man builds when he has been farming the same land through the full range of what the land and the market produced. He had farmed through the difficult years of the late 1960s when commodity prices had been compressed and the cost of inputs had been increasing. and through the better years of the early 1970s, when the Soviet grain purchases had driven commodity prices to their highest levels in decades, and through the late 1970s, when the commodity price softening had been beginning, but when the memory of the early 1970s boom had still been influencing the planning and the financial decisions of many of the farmers in the county. He had managed through all of these years with a specific conservatism about debt that had been the product partly of the difficult years and partly of the specific accounting that his cousin Elbert had been providing for several years. The accounting that contextualized the operating decisions within the broader financial environment in ways that Horace's own agricultural knowledge did not automatically provide. The conservatism had not been absolute. Horace had carried notes on equipment and on the operating account in years when the notes had been the appropriate way to manage the cash flow requirements of the operation. But the conservatism had been a specific disposition toward debt that made him resistant to the bare 0% offer in a way that many of his neighbors had not been. Horace Tipton was 58 years old in March of 1980 and had been farming 312 acres of Orangeburg County row crop ground since 1962. 18 years of cotton and soybeans and grain sorghum on the coastal plain soil of the South Carolina Lowcountry. Soil that produced well when it was managed correctly, and that produced the specific income profile of a commodity crop. Operation in the American South in the late 1970s, which was an income profile that the combination of the Soviet grain purchases of the early 1970s and the commodity price run-up of that decade had made look better than it had historically looked. The 4,240 was what Horace needed. His primary tractor, a 1968 John Deere 3020, had been the workhorse of the operation for 12 years and was reaching the age at which the cost of keeping it in service was approaching the point where replacement made sense. The 4,240 was the machine that could replace the 3020 and handle the full range of operations that the 312 operator row crop operation required. 0% for 5 years was a genuinely attractive offer for an equipment purchase that Horace had been considering for 18 months. He had stood in Ray Norwood's showroom and had thought about it for about 20 minutes, which was the thinking time that 18 months of prior consideration produced when it was applied to a specific offer with specific terms. The no had been a harder no than it appeared in the telling, because Horace had been watching his primary tractor's maintenance costs increase for 2 seasons and had been thinking about replacement for 18 months, and had come to the dealership that Tuesday afternoon with the specific intention of evaluating whether the terms were acceptable. The 0% offer had been designed to make the terms acceptable. The design had been working on Horace throughout the 20 minutes he stood in front of the 4-40. He had been calculating the total cost of the 0% deal against the total cost of the operation's current approach, which was continuing with the aging 3020 and absorbing the increasing maintenance costs rather than taking on a new note. He had been calculating the specific monthly cash flow that the 0% note would require against the monthly cash flow that the operation was currently producing. The calculation had not produced a clear answer, because the cash flow from the operation was variable in the way that commodity crop cash flow was variable, and the monthly note payment was fixed in the way that notes were fixed, and the variability and the fixedness were the specific combination that Horace had been thinking about for 18 months. The thinking had not produced a decision before the Tuesday afternoon visit. What it had produced was the understanding that the decision required more information than he had. and that the 20 minutes in front of the 4,240 were not the right venue for acquiring that information. He had said he was going to think about it some more. That was the truth. He had then said no. Ray had been surprised. He had not expected Horace to say no to 0% for 5 years, because in Ray's experience, 0% for 5 years was not something that most farmers said no to. He had asked why. Horace had said he was going to think about it some more. He had driven back to the farm and had called his cousin, Elbert Means, who worked in a trust department in Columbia and who had been Horace's source of financial information and advice for several years on the questions that farm finance raised that Horace did not have the specific background to answer himself. He had described the 0% 5-year offer to Elbert. The quiet had been the quiet of a trust department professional in Columbia who was hearing something that his professional experience placed in a specific category of financial instruments that he had been paying attention to in his work. Instruments that the agricultural credit expansion of the 1970s had produced in large numbers, and that were beginning to show the specific characteristics of instruments that had been designed for an environment that was changing. Elbert Means had been working in the trust department of a Columbia bank since 1971 and had developed over that time the specific professional knowledge of agricultural finance in South Carolina that a trust officer in a state with significant agricultural assets developed, knowledge of the land values and the commodity markets and the credit instruments and the financial institutions that served the agricultural sector. He had been watching the agricultural credit system with increasing concern through 1979 and into 1980, because the combination of the commodity price softening that had begun in the late 1970s and the interest rate increases that the Federal Reserve's inflation-fighting policy was producing was a combination that the agricultural credit instruments of the expansion era had not been designed to withstand. His concern was not yet the public concern that the farm crisis would eventually produce, because the crisis was in its early stages in March of 1980, and the specific institutional failures that would become visible in 1982 and 1983 were not yet visible. But the concern was there, in the professional understanding of a man who worked with the instruments and the institutions and who could read the trajectory. Elbert had been quiet for a moment. The specific financial analysis that Elbert had been performing in the days between Horace's first phone call and the callback had been the analysis of a trust department professional asking the questions his training required. The first question was how the 0% terms were being financed, because 0% for 5 years in a 16% interest rate environment had a cost to someone, and the question was who was paying it and how. The answer was that the cost was being shared between the manufacturer's subsidy and the structure of the financial instruments backing the program. The second and third questions were about the quality of those instruments and the institutions holding them. The answers had produced the quiet at the beginning of the second call. He had not been able to tell Horace that the Orangeburg savings and loan would fail. He had been able to tell Horace that the instruments backing the offer were instruments he would not want to have notes with in the developing environment. The distinction had been important. The recommendation had been clear. He had then said that 0% financing from a manufacturer's finance division was an unusual product in the current interest rate environment, and that unusual financial products in unusual interest rate environments sometimes had characteristics that were not visible in the marketing materials. He had asked if Horace knew which specific financial institution was backing the John Deere credit program. Horace had said he did not know specifically. Elbert had said he would look into it. He had called back 2 days later. He had said the John Deere credit program for the 0% promotion was being backed by the same general pool of agricultural credit instruments that many of the smaller agricultural banks and credit associations in the region were investing in instruments that had been structured in the mid-1970s when the agricultural economy had been in its expansion phase and that were carrying the specific characteristics of instruments designed for an expanding agricultural economy and that were now being tested by the early 1980s conditions that were not the conditions those instruments had been designed for. He had said that in his professional view, the 0% offer was being extended at a cost to the manufacturer's finance division that the division would be able to absorb in the circumstances of 1980, but that the instruments backing the program were the same instruments that were creating stress in the agricultural credit system more broadly. He had said that in plain language, the 0% offer was a real offer from a real company and was not likely to produce the kind of problem that the instruments behind it were creating for some of the smaller agricultural financial institutions in the region. But he had also said that the instruments behind the offer were the instruments that were producing the agricultural credit stress that was beginning to be visible in 1980 and that would become more visible in the following years. Horace had listened to all of this. The specific question that Horace had asked Elbert at the end of the phone call, "What would you do?" was the question that cut through the professional analysis and the financial instrument description and the institutional concern and arrived at the practical decision that Horace needed to make. Elbert had been providing professional context. Horace had been trying to decide whether to buy a tractor. The gap between the professional context and the practical decision was the gap that the question was crossing, and Elbert had answered it in the terms it required, which were the terms of specific personal recommendation rather than professional analysis. The recommendation had been clear and direct. Horace had received it and had made the decision that the recommendation implied, which was to find a tractor he could buy for cash rather than taking the 0% note. The decision had been Horace's decision. The recommendation had been Elbert's recommendation. The execution had been finding the 1256 at Louis Gall's lot. He had said, "What would you do?" Elbert had said he would not take on a new note in the current environment, that the rate environment was going to produce stress in the agricultural credit system in ways that were not yet visible, and that having outstanding notes when the stress arrived was a different situation than not having outstanding notes when the stress arrived. He had said if Horace needed the tractor, he should buy it for cash or not buy it. Horace had said he did not have cash for the $4,240. Elbert had said then Horace should not buy the $4,240. Louis Gall had been running the International Harvester dealership in Santee since 1971, serving the farming operations in the southern part of Orangeburg County and the northern part of Calhoun County from the Santee location, which was about 12 miles south of Orangeburg and which served the row crop operations in that part of the coastal plain. The 1966 Farmall 1256 had been on Lewis's lot since the fall of 1978, a trade-in from a Calhoun County operation that had moved to larger equipment and that had taken the 1256 in on a trade at the price Louis had needed to offer to get the larger equipment deal done. The 1256 at Louis' asking price had not moved in 2 seasons, which was why Louis' price had come down to the $1,800 that Horace had further negotiated to in April of 1980. Louis had been honest with Horace about the 1256's history and condition. which was the practice that Louis had maintained through 9 years in the dealership. The practice of telling the customer what the piece was, rather than what the customer wanted to hear about it. He had said the 1256 had been worked hard on the Calhoun County operation, that it had the hours that 14 years of hard service produced, and that 2 specific mechanical items needed attention before the machine was in full service condition. He had also said that the 1256, in the condition it was in, once the 2 repairs were made, was a machine that could run the row crop operations that Horace was describing for several more years with appropriate maintenance. Horace had looked at the machine with the eye of a man who had been maintaining farm equipment for 18 years and had concluded that Louis was describing the machine accurately. He had bought it. Horace had driven to the Farmall dealer in Santee, D., a man named Louis Gall, who had been selling international harvester equipment in Orangeburg County since 1971 and who had a 1966 Farmall 1256 on his lot that had been traded in by a large operation in Calhoun County that was upgrading its equipment. The 1966 Farmall 1256 was not the machine that the 4240 was. It was 14 years old and had the specific condition of a 14-year-old tractor that had been in heavy service on a large commodity crop operation. But it was priced at $1,800, which was the price that Louis Gall had on it after 2 seasons on the lot. And $1,800 was within the range of what Horace could pay from his operating account. The $1,800 had come from the operating account, which Horace had been building through the good years of the late 1970s with the specific intention of having a cash reserve for the equipment replacement that he had known was coming when the 3020's maintenance costs had begun to increase. The reserve had not been large enough for the 4240. It had been sufficient for the 1256. Louis Gall had been straightforward about the 1256's condition, had told Horace that it had been in heavy service and that it needed 2 specific repairs that Louis had not done because the previous asking price had not justified them, repairs to the clutch linkage and to the front axle bearing that were mechanical work rather than anything that indicated a fundamental problem with the machine. Horace had negotiated the price down from $2,200 to $1,800 on the basis of the needed repairs, an $800 discount that he had verified was reasonable against the cost of the work by calling his regular mechanic before completing the purchase. He had paid $1,800 and had had the repairs done for $412, making the total investment $2,212 for a running tractor that did not require a note. $2,212 cash was not the same capability as a $6,800, $4,240 on a 0% note, but it was a tractor on the farm that was paid for. In the environment that was coming, that distinction was going to matter more than the capability difference. He had paid $1,800 for the 1256 on a Thursday afternoon in April of 1980. The Orangeburg Savings and Loan had been one of the agricultural savings and loan institutions that had developed in the South Carolina coastal plain during the post-war decades, institutions that had grown alongside the expansion of commodity agriculture in the region and that had built their loan portfolios around the agricultural assets of the counties they served. The institution had been sound through the expansion years of the 1970s, when the agricultural land values and commodity prices had been supporting the agricultural loan portfolios that institutions like the Orangeburg Savings and Loan were carrying. The 0% financing programs that the institution had been backing were programs that made sense in the context of an agricultural economy that was producing the income to service the notes and the land values to collateralize them. The early 1980s had produced conditions that were different from the conditions the 0% programs had been designed for. Conditions that had combined compressed commodity prices with the high interest rates that the Federal Reserve's inflation control had produced, and with the land value corrections that the compressed commodity prices and the high interest rates had together been producing. The combination had been the specific combination that the agricultural savings and loan institutions of the region had not been capitalized to withstand, and the Orangeburg Savings and Loan had been among the institutions that the combination had brought to regulatory supervision by the fall of 1982. The regulatory supervision had been the institutional expression of what Elbert had described. In March of 1980, as the stress that the agricultural credit instruments were beginning to show, the stress had arrived. The institution had not withstood it. The Orangeburg Savings and Loan, which had been the financial institution behind several of the agricultural equipment financing programs in the county, including the program through which the John Deere 0% offer was being administered, had been placed under regulatory supervision by the South Carolina State Board of Financial Institutions in November of 1982. The regulatory supervision had produced the specific outcome that regulatory supervision of a financial institution under stress produced, which was the restriction of the institution's ability to extend new credit and the requirement that the institution work through its existing loan portfolio in a way that addressed the specific exposures that had produced the regulatory concern. For the farmers in Orangeburg County who had notes through the Orangeburg Savings and Loan, the regulatory supervision had produced the specific and unwelcome experience of having their loan terms reviewed by the institution's new regulatory management, and of discovering that the terms that had been agreed to with the institution's previous management were being revisited in ways that the previous management had not represented would happen. The three neighbors' situations were each specific in their details but similar in their general character, which was the character of farmers who had taken the 0% offer at face value and had structured their equipment financing around the terms that the offer had described. The 0% terms had been the terms the institution had represented they would be throughout the 5-year period. The regulatory supervision had changed the institution's ability to maintain those representations, because regulatory supervision came with requirements about capital adequacy and loan portfolio quality that the institution's existing notes were not meeting at the 1983 conditions. The instruments that had been structured to offer 0% through the normal accounting mechanisms of deferred interest or manufacturer subsidy or instrument structure had been structured for a specific set of market conditions, conditions in which the agricultural economy was producing the income that made the notes serviceable, and in which the financial institutions backing the instruments were operating within their normal parameters. The 1983 conditions had not been those conditions, and the instruments had not been designed for conditions other than the ones they had been designed for. The three neighbors had not known this when they had signed the notes in 1979, 1980, and 1981. Most of the people who had signed the notes had not known it. The knowledge had required the specific professional background that Elbert Means had, or the specific legal and financial reading that most farmers had not done before signing. 3 of Horace's neighbors had notes through the Orangeburg Savings and Loan from equipment purchases they had made between 1979 and 1981. notes that had been written with specific interest rate provisions that the 0% marketing had represented as the institution's standard terms for qualified agricultural borrowers. The regulatory management had revisited those terms in 1983. The revisitation had not been comfortable for any of the three. One of them, a man named Carlton Webb, who farmed 240 acres of row crop ground adjacent to the Tipton place, had his note called in the spring of 1983 when the regulatory management had determined that Carlton's debt-to-income ratio was above the threshold that the institution's revised credit standards required. The note calling had come at the specific worst moment that note calling could come, which was the spring planting season when the operation needed every financial resource it had for the seasonal inputs. Carlton had managed to refinance the note through the Production Credit Association in Orangeburg, but at the rates that the 1983 environment produced rather than the rates that the 0% program had represented. And the difference between the two had been a financial burden that Carlton had been carrying through the subsequent years. Horace had the 1256. It was paid for. It had been paid for since April of 1980. It continued to work the 312 acres of Orangeburg County row crop ground through the regulatory stress and the note calling and the refinancing that had characterized the agricultural credit situation in the county from 1982 through 1986. Ray had been in the farm equipment business in Orangeburg County for 18 years and had developed through those years the specific understanding of how equipment financing worked in a county-level agricultural market, the understanding of which financial institutions were serving which customers, and what the relationships between those institutions and the equipment they were financing looked like from the dealer's side. He had known the Orangeburg savings and loan in the specific way that a dealer who had been routing customer financing through a financial institution for several years knew that institution through the documentation and the processing and the specific relationship with the institution's agricultural lending personnel. He had not known, in the spring of 1980, that the institution was going to be under regulatory supervision by the fall of 1982. If he had known, he would not have been routing customer financing through it. He had learned what he learned about the institution's problems the same way that the farmers who had notes with it had learned. Through the regulatory announcement and the subsequent communications from the institution's regulatory management, and he had learned it too late to have done anything different in 1980. What he had understood when he learned it was that Horace's decision in the spring of 1982 not take the 0% offer had been a decision that had avoided the specific problem that the institution's regulatory status had produced for the farmers who had taken the offer. He had called Horace in the fall of 1983 not to tell Horace something Horace did not know, but to acknowledge something that Horace had done that Ray had not appreciated at the time. Ray Norwood had understood what the Orangeburg savings and loans regulatory problems had meant for the farmers who had taken notes through the 0% program, had understood it in the specific way that a dealer understood it when the customers who had used his dealership's finance partner to complete their equipment purchases found themselves in difficulty with that finance partner. He had called Horace in the fall of 1983 and had said he thought Horace had made the right decision in the spring of 1980. Horace had said he was not sure he had made the right decision. He had said Elbert had made the right recommendation and that he had followed the recommendation. Ray had said that was the same thing. Horace had said he supposed it was. He had said that he did not know at the time whether Elbert's recommendation was going to turn out to be right, and that the not knowing was the part that had made the decision difficult. Ray had said he understood that. He had also said that he was going to have to stop running the 0% promotion, because the financial institution that had been backing it was no longer able to back it, and that the 1984 spring selling season was going to be the first in 3 years that he would be selling equipment on standard terms. Horace had said he understood and that he was going to need to talk about a tractor for the following year, because the 1256 was getting to the age where the maintenance cost was approaching the replacement threshold. They had talked. The conversation had been the conversation that two men who had been in a difficult situation, in opposite positions, have when the situation has resolved and the distance from it is sufficient for honest accounting. The 1985 purchase had been the purchase that the 1980 decision had made possible, in the specific sense that the 5 years of managing the operation with the 1256 had been the bridge between the decision not to take the 0% note and the environment in which a new equipment purchase could be made on terms that were sustainable. The new tractor was a John Deere 4850, which was the current generation high-power row crop tractor in the John Deere line in 1985, and the purchase had been made through Ray Norwood's dealership with the specific straightforwardness that the relationship between the two men had developed through the years since 1980. Ray had not pushed Horace toward any financing program in 1985. He had presented the standard terms and had let Horace evaluate them with Elbert before completing the purchase. Because the 1980 experience had taught Ray the value of letting a customer like Horace make the decision on his own terms rather than trying to speed it through a promotional structure. Horace had called Elbert, as he always did with equipment purchase decisions. Elbert had looked at the terms and had said they were within the range that the current environment supported, and that the note was a note that the operation could service from its cash flow. Horace had signed. The 4850 had gone to work on the 312 acres. The 1256 had gone to the secondary tractor roll that it would fill through the following years. Carlton Webb's experience in the spring of 1983 had been the specific experience that Elbert had been gesturing toward in March of 1980, when he had described the instruments and the institutions as subjects of concern. Carlton had been a competent farmer and a prudent man in most of the dimensions of his farming, and his decision to take the 0% offer in 1980 had been the decision that most of the competent and prudent farmers in Orangeburg County had made, because the offer had been real and the terms had been clearly better than the standard terms, and the institution had been an established institution in the county. What Carlton had not known when he signed was that the 0% offer's institutional backing was the specific category of institutional backing that was most exposed to the conditions that the early 1980s were producing. He had signed in good faith. The note had been called in bad conditions. The calling had not been his fault. It had been the result of conditions that he had not been able to anticipate from the information available to him in 1980. It had also been the result of conditions that Elbert had been able to partially anticipate from the information available to him in his professional role in 1980. The difference between what Carlton had known and what Elbert had known was the difference between the information available from the marketing materials and the information available from the professional analysis of the instruments and institutions behind the marketing materials. The marketing materials had been optimistic. The professional analysis had been cautious. Horace had had access to the professional analysis. Carlton had not. The difference had been the phone call. The specific parallel between the 0% financing offer and the instruments behind it is worth making explicit for the understanding it provides of what Elbert was concerned about in March of 1980. 0% for 5 years in a 16% interest rate environment required that someone absorb the 15 to 16% annual difference between the zero rate being offered and the prevailing rate for the money being deployed. The manufacturer's subsidy covered part of this. The financial instruments structure covered the rest. The financial instruments structure. In the specific case of the instruments that the Orangeburg Savings and Loan was using, involved the institution accepting terms on its liabilities that were favorable in the 1980 environment and would become less favorable if the interest rate environment changed in ways that compressed the institution's margin. The Federal Reserve was actively changing the interest rate environment in 1980. Elbert had known this. He had not known the specific timeline of the institution's subsequent regulatory supervision. He had known that the instruments and the institutions were in a category that was being stressed by conditions that were being actively created by the Federal Reserve's policy. He had told Horace not to take on a new note. Horace had not taken on a new note. The institution had been placed under regulatory supervision 2 years later. The analysis had been correct. The timing had been uncertain. The decision had been right, regardless of the timing. The South Carolina coastal plain agricultural economy in 1980 was an economy that shared the specific characteristics of the American agricultural economy more broadly in that year, the characteristics of an expansion cycle that had produced significant debt and that was beginning to encounter the conditions that expansion cycle debt encountered when the environment changed. Orangeburg County's row crop operations had been expanding through the 1970s with the specific confidence that the Soviet grain purchases and the commodity price run-up had produced, expanding in acreage and in equipment and in the use of the capital that the agricultural finance system had been making available. The county's agricultural savings and loan institutions had been growing alongside the expansion, their loan portfolios expanding as the county's farming operations expanded, their instrument portfolios reflecting the specific financial instruments that the expansion era had produced. The Orangeburg Savings and Loan had been part of this expansion, and the 0% financing program it had been backing had been one expression of the financial creativity that expansion-era institutions used to stay competitive in an environment where everyone was looking for the best terms and the best access to capital. The creative terms had been real when they were offered. The institutions behind them had been real when they were offered. The conditions had changed. The creativity had not been designed for the changed conditions. The institutions had not been capitalized for them. Horace had been watching the conditions change for 18 months. Elbert had been watching them for longer. The phone call had connected what Elbert was watching to the decision Horace was about to make. The 1256 had been the product of the connection. The conversation between Horace and Ray Norwood in the fall of 1983 had been a conversation that neither of them had planned specifically. The kind of conversation that two people who have had a commercial relationship through a difficult period have, when the difficulty has reached a point of resolution and both parties can see the shape of what has happened. Ray had called, and that was notable because it was the salesman calling the customer rather than the standard direction of that call. And the calling had been the specific acknowledgement that made the conversation what it needed to be. He had said he thought Horace had made the right decision in the spring of 1980. The acknowledgment had been important, not because Horace needed the external validation of his decision, but because the acknowledgment was the closing of a loop that the 1980 showroom visit had opened. The loop that had been opened was the implicit judgment that Ray had been making in the spring of 1980, when Horace had declined the 0% offer. The implicit professional judgment of a salesman who had just not made a sale he had expected to make. The 1983 acknowledgment had closed the loop. The professional judgment had been wrong. The customer's decision had been right. The acknowledgment had said so. The conversation had been what it needed to be. Horace had bought a new tractor from Ray in 1985 on standard terms, at the rates that the 1985 environment produced, which were substantially lower than the 1980 rates had been because the Federal Reserve's work on inflation had by 1985 produced the rate reduction that the 1980 rate peak had eventually led to. The 5-year delay had been the 5 years during which the 0% promotions supporting institution had gone through regulatory supervision, and the agricultural credit crisis had produced the specific difficulty for Horace's neighbors that the notes had created. The delay had also been the 5 years during which the interest rate environment had changed, from the peak rates of 1980 to the lower rates of 1985, which meant that the 1985 purchase had been made at rates that were substantially more favorable than the 1980 rates that the 0% offer had been designed to overcome. The delay had therefore been a double benefit. It had avoided the institutional problem that had produced Carlton Webb's note-calling experience, and it had positioned the purchase in the more favorable rate environment that the 1985 conditions represented. Neither of these benefits had been predictable with certainty in April of 1980 when Horace had made the decision. The institutional problem had not been visible to Elbert in the specific form it would take, only in the general form of the agricultural credit stress that the 1980 instruments and institutions were subject to. The rate reduction had not been guaranteed, only the possibility of it. The decision had been made in uncertainty. The certainty had arrived over the following 5 years. The certainty had confirmed the decision. The decision in 1982 not take the 0% offer had delayed the purchase by 5 years. The delay had been the right decision. The 1256 had provided the 5 years of service that the delay required. The right machine, purchased at the right price, had provided the bridge between the decision not to take the note and the purchase of the new equipment on terms that the subsequent environment had made more favorable. Elbert's recommendation had been the foundation of the decision. Horace's execution had been the implementation. The 1256 had been the bridge. The bank's collapse had been the confirmation, not the proof that the decision had been right, because the decision had been right on the day it was made based on the analysis Elbert had provided, but the confirmation that the analysis had been correct. The specific accounting of what it meant that Horace had kept the Farmall through the regulatory crisis years is worth making explicit, because the keeping was not simply a financial positive but a specific operational outcome that had direct consequences for the farm's continued ability to produce. Carlton Webb's note-calling in the spring of 1983 had come at the planting season, when the operation's financial resources were fully committed to the seasonal inputs, the seed and the fertilizer and the fuel and the herbicide that the planting season required. Adding the financial stress of a note renegotiation at that specific moment had meant that Carlton had been managing to significant financial demands simultaneously, the seasonal inputs and the note refinancing, at the moment when the operation's cash flow was at its lowest point in the annual cycle. Horace had not had this specific simultaneous financial demand in the spring of 1983. He had had the seasonal input costs, which were the same for his operation as for he had not had the note renegotiation costs, or the note calling pressure, or the refinancing process. His financial resources in the spring of 1983 had been committed to the planting season, and to nothing else. The planting had proceeded without the specific additional stress that Carlton and the other neighbors, with Orangeburg savings and loan notes, had been managing. The planting had produced the crop. The cash buyer had kept his Farmall. The specific accounting of what it meant that Horace had been able to plant in the spring of 1983 without the note-calling pressure that Carlton Webb had experienced is the accounting of a farming season that proceeded according to plan rather than the accounting of a farming season that proceeded despite a significant additional financial burden. A planting season that proceeds according to plan produces the crop on schedule and at the input cost and management quality that the schedule allows. A planting season that proceeds despite a significant additional financial burden produces the crop under the specific stress that financial burden creates. The stress of diverted attention and diverted resources and the compressed decision-making that a financial crisis creates in any enterprise that is dependent on the decisions made in that season. The 1983 Orangeburg County crop had been planted by Horace on schedule, at the correct input levels, with the management attention that the crop required. Carlton Webb's 1983 crop had been planted in the specific circumstances of a note-calling negotiation, with the attention and resources that those circumstances allowed. The difference between the two had been the difference between having a paid-for tractor and having a tractor on a note with an institution that was under regulatory supervision. The Farmall had kept the farm, not by being the best machine in the county, by being a paid-for machine in a county where being paid for had become the thing that mattered most. The Farmall had kept the farm. Through the years, when the institution that had been offering 0% for 5 years was no longer in a position to offer anything at all. That is the whole of what the title describes. The 0% offer had been a real offer from a real institution in March of 1980. The institution was under regulatory supervision by November of 1982. The farmers who had taken the offer were managing the consequences of the institution's regulatory status. The farmer who had not taken the offer was planting his crops. The 1256 had been the reason he had been planting his crops. Elbert had been the reason he had the 1256. The phone call to Elbert had been the reason Elbert had been the reason. The decision to call Elbert before buying had been the reason for the phone call. The decision had been the reason for everything. A man who is farming carefully does not make equipment decisions without understanding the financial environment his equipment decisions exist in. Horace had been farming carefully. Elbert was the financial environment. The phone call had been the connection. The 1256 had been the result. The farm had continued. That was the whole of it. That was what it meant to be a cash buyer, not the absence of debt. The specific presence of something paid for. Something paid for was something that could not be called. Something that could not be called was something that kept working. The 1256 had kept working. The farm had kept working. The institution had not. The 0% had not lasted 5 years. The cash tractor had lasted longer. That was the difference. That was the whole of the difference. Was no longer in a position to offer anything at all. Elbert Means had been providing financial analysis to Horace since the late 1960s. when Horace had encountered a land purchase opportunity that had required more financial sophistication than his agricultural background had given him, and had called his cousin, who worked in the Columbia Trust Department. The relationship had developed from that initial consultation into a practice of regular communication about the financial dimensions of the farming decisions that Horace was making. Communication that had become one of the more valuable ongoing resources that the farming operation had. Horace had provided from his side the specific agricultural knowledge of what the farm could produce and what it required, and how the physical reality of farming played out in each season. Elbert had provided from his side the specific financial knowledge of how the money moved through the agricultural economy, and what the instruments and institutions that touched the farm's financial life were doing, and what the environment they were operating in was producing. The combination of the two knowledge sets was the combination that the 1980 decision had drawn on. A farmer who knew his farm and a trust officer who knew the financial environment had made a better decision together than either would have made alone. Horace alone would not have known to ask the question about the instruments behind the 0% offer. Elbert alone would not have known the specific farming operations needs and constraints that shaped what the right alternative was. Together they had known both, and the knowledge of both had produced the decision to call Louis Gall and buy the 1256 for $1,800. The 1256 had been what the combined knowledge had found. The combined knowledge had been what the relationship had produced. The relationship had been what the 1980 decision had drawn on. The 1980 decision had been what the farm's continuation in 1983 had depended on. The farm's continuation in 1983 had been what everything afterward had been built on. The chain ran back to the phone call. The phone call ran back to the relationship. The relationship had been worth more than the 0% offer, because the relationship had produced the 1256, and the 1256 had been what mattered. The Orangeburg County farming community's experience of the early 1980s agricultural credit crisis had been like the experience of every farming community that went through it. A combination of the community-wide impact of the conditions that everyone was experiencing, and the specific individual outcomes that different financial positions produced. The community-wide impact had been the compressed commodity prices and the high interest rates and the land value corrections that had affected every farm in the county, regardless of its debt position. The specific individual outcomes had been different, because the compressed commodity prices and the high interest rates and the land value corrections had been the same for every farm, but the debt load that each farm was carrying had been different, and the difference in debt load had been the difference in how much damage the conditions had produced. The farms that had been carrying significant debt had been carrying it against commodity income that was now lower, and land values that were now lower, and at interest rates that were now higher, and the combination had been the specific combination that the farm crisis produced in its most acute form. The farms that had been carrying less debt had been experiencing the same compressed commodity prices and the same land value corrections, but without the multiplying factor of the debt, and the experience without the multiplying factor had been a difficult time rather than a crisis. Horace's farm had been in the second category. He had been having a difficult time in 1982 and 1983. He had not been in crisis. The difference had been the 1256 and the phone call and the relationship, and the decision made in the spring of 1980 when the 0% had been the offer, and the understanding that the offer was not all there was to understand about the situation, and the courage to say no to a good offer in order to act on a better understanding. That was the whole of it. Horace had the understanding. Elbert had provided it. The 1256 had expressed it. The farm had continued because of it. The story of Horace Tipton's 1980 decision is often told in the simplified form that agricultural stories about financial prudence are told. The form of a farmer who was smart enough to avoid debt when everyone else was taking it on, and who was vindicated when the debt-takers had problems. The simplified form is not wrong, but it is incomplete. The more complete form is the story of a farmer who was connected to the right information at the right moment, and who acted on the information rather than on the offer that was in front of him. The information was Elbert's professional reading of the instruments and the institutions behind the 0% offer. The connection was the phone call that Horace had been in the habit of making to Elbert before significant financial decisions. The action was saying no to the 0% offer and yes to the $1,800 1256. The 1800s had worked together. The simplified form gave Horace the credit for the wisdom. The complete form gave Elbert the credit for the analysis, Horace the credit for the phone call, and the relationship between the two men, the credit for the connection that made the analysis available to the decision. The relationship was what produced the right decision, not the individual wisdom of a single person. The combined knowledge of two people who were in the habit of talking to each other about the decisions that mattered. Horace had the farm. Elbert had the financial knowledge. The phone call had been the bridge. The 1256 had been the result. The farm had been the continuation. The institution had collapsed. The cash buyer had kept the farm. That was what the phone call and the 1256 and the right information and the right relationship had produced. In Orangeburg County, South Carolina, in 1980, when the 0% had been the offer and the 1256 had been the answer, Ray Norwood continued to operate the John Deere dealership in Orangeburg through the farm crisis years and beyond, selling equipment in a market that the crisis had restructured in ways that affected the dealership's business significantly. The 0% promotions did not come back after 1983, because the financial institution that had backed them was no longer in a position to back them, and because the broader agricultural credit market in South Carolina had been restructured by the crisis in ways that made the promotional terms of the expansion era unavailable. The standard terms of the mid-1980s, after the Federal Reserve's work on inflation had reduced the prevailing rates from the 1980 peak, were substantially more favorable than the 1980 standard terms had been, which meant that the standard terms of 1985 and 1986 were competitive with the 0% terms of 1980 in ways that made the promotional terms less necessary. The 4,850 that Horace had bought from Ray in 1985 on standard terms at the lower rates had been bought on terms that were reasonable in themselves, rather than terms that required an institutional structure to make them competitive. Ray had said to his wife in the spring of 1985, when the 4,850 sale was completing, that the equipment business was easier when the financing was straightforward. She had said it usually was. He had said he thought the 0% promotions had produced results he had not understood fully when he was running them. She had said that was probably right. He had thought about Horace Tipton's spring 1980 visit and had understood what the results were that he had not understood fully. The results had been the customers who had taken the terms and who had been in Carlton Webb's position in 1983. Horace had not been in Carlton Webb's position. Horace had bought the 1256 The 1256 had kept working. The farm had kept working. The 0% had not lasted 5 years. The 1256 had lasted longer. That was the whole of the difference. One final accounting. The Orangeburg Savings and Loan had offered 0% for 5 years. The institution had lasted 2.5 years before regulatory supervision. The 0% had not lasted 5 years. The 1256 had lasted the 5 years, and then 5 more. The institution had offered the terms. The tractor had provided the service. The institution had not been able to sustain its terms. The tractor had been able to sustain its service. Horace had chosen the tractor. Elbert had recommended the choice. The farm had continued. That is the whole of the story. The right relationship, the right phone call, the right decision, the right tractor, the farm still standing. The institution not. Orangeburg County, South Carolina, 1980. A Tuesday afternoon in March, a showroom floor. A 0% offer, a 20-minute consideration, a phone call to a cousin in Columbia, an analysis, a recommendation, an $1,800 Farmall 1256 in Santee. A Thursday afternoon, in April, a farm that continued through the years that tested it, because the right answer had been found before the test arrived, because the right question had been asked before the answer was needed, because the right relationship had been maintained before the right question could be asked. All of it together, all of it from the phone call, all of it from the decision to call before buying. That was the gift. The 1256 was the expression of the gift. The farm was what the gift had made possible. The decision to call before buying was the decision that made everything else possible. That is the whole of the lesson. Not about tractors. About knowing who to call before you sign. Horace had known who to call. He had called. The call had produced the analysis. The analysis had produced the decision. The decision had produced the 1256. The 1256 had kept the farm running through the years that tested it. The institution had not kept running. The tractor had. That is the difference between 0% on a note and $1,800 cash for a machine that belongs to you.